Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make a motion to suspend the rules and place a public hearing prior to the start of our October 14th Common Council agenda. This hearing would be for members of the public to share their ideas and opinions on how we may add a public comment section to our regularly scheduled agendas.
Person Hart.
I'll second.
Questions or comments?
So my question, since when I have discussion on it, is this how it was worded, is a one-time public hearing?
Correct.
And there's no limits?
Just the limits would be what our already existent public hearing rules are.
So will this hearing, this public hearing, can this be personal attacks against somebody?
It's limited to ideas and opinions of how we can add a public comment section to the agenda.
Then that would be it.
Any additional comments? Yes.
Judging by the more than a dozen people here, I believe that they probably have opinions on this, and I think that it would probably be a good idea to give them that opportunity to be able to discuss if they think a public comment section is a good idea or not. I think it's a pretty benign ask to have just a simple one-time public hearing on the topic.
Person Hamilton?
Regarding Dennis's question, my understanding then is that there is no personal or whatever
Personal attacks.
attacks or anything on this public hearing in which we're going to discuss whether to have public hearings on the agenda. That's not to say that once, if we do approve that there will or will not be personal attacks, defamatory, things like that.
My opinion is that that will be something that will have to be discussed and did if we decide to have the public hearings of what the parameters are going to be. I believe if this is going to, after the public hearing, if it's decided that we do add public comment to the agenda, that should go back to a committee, leg and reg, I would assume, and it should be discussed of how it's going to be handled. Because I will not support it if there's not a comment in there that it cannot be personal attacks against somebody. That is not the place for that, because we won't be able to respond to it, and we're just gonna be run up the flagpole and you can't respond. It's gonna be a one-sided conversation, and I mean, there's a lot of good things that could come out of that, just, it can't be personal attacks.
Person Hart.
I kind of agree with that, but I would have to say that I think as elected officials, I think it's only on employees. I mean, if they've got a problem with elected official, I guess if they want to vent about that, I guess I'm just saying, I don't think it should come against employees that are employed, and I count that differently than elected officials. Because that may be the only forum that someone can come from, a citizen, if they have a problem with an elected official. I think that's different than an employee who is employed where there is disciplinary things. There is no disciplinary things for an elected official. So I definitely agree with no employees that are under the guidelines of disciplinary action being taken against them. But when it comes to elected officials, I'll probably be the first one to say is it comes with the territory.
Just let me clarify one thing first. We do have a policy that allows us to file a complaint against an elected official. So there is that policy right now and that procedure that we can do that with. We have had them in the past against council members.
To Dennis's point about it going to leg and reg, I do kind of agree with that. I would like to see this officially go through ordinance, and for, if we were going to add this, that it would actually have a chance to go through and actually be voted on, obviously, by the committee, but also by this body. And that way I mean, that way it's actually written down what it is, the parameters of it, as, I think that is probably the proper way to do it. But at least for the motion made at this point is not to add public comment. It would be just to have a public hearing, just to get some ideas from members of the public. Maybe they might have some ideas how we might be able to set those parameters.
Alderperson Charles?
I'm definitely not opposed to having this public hearing for input on how we could do that. I think if we go past that step, it shouldn't go directly to legislative. I think possibly we should have it as a committee as a whole, because otherwise, as chairperson of legislative, I'm going to require everybody on council to be at that legislative meeting so we can all have input, which then would make it a committee as a whole. So we might as well just go right to committee as a whole and then take it back to legislative to have it written in an ordinance form. So, and Jesse, I'd have to bow to you on if that's the correct way to do that. I just want to make sure that we don't go to legislative, come to council, go back and forth on it, and go back to legislative. If we're going to do this, let's do it the correct way right off the bat.
Procedurally, it could be done either way. The city is primarily not a committee of the whole structure, though. So the way it's set up right now, the proper way would be to try it in a subcommittee first and take it to the council. Maybe it does take a couple meetings at the council to get through. That would be my, the structure. We had this discussion years ago with the committee of the whole, and it wasn't selected by the council.
All right.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to say I had a lady call me this afternoon, one of my constituents in my district, who said that she was in favor of this. So I told her that if this was brought up, that I would say that I did have a call on it. So I had one call on it so far.
And just in response to Mark's comment about the alderman, and I don't have any problem if somebody wants to run me up the flagpole, but other than we have in our ordinance of how to handle that, there's another way they can recall us, if they're not happy with us. But what I'm concerned about is not only city employees. I'm concerned about is that you've got a neighbor coming in that's gonna run his neighbor up the flagpole and his neighbor don't even know it. And all of a sudden, that's what comes into the meeting and that neighbor doesn't have a chance to defend himself. It just isn't fair. It cannot be, there's a process to do that, and the process is not to start at an open meeting at City Hall.
Alderperson Watford?
Why do we want to do this? Why do we want to have these where people can kind of speak unchecked at a common council meeting? Has anybody been denied a chance to speak if you go through the correct procedures? Which is, if you have a problem, what's worked well in the past is you get a hold of your alderman and the alderman will get you and your issue on the agenda for a committee. Then the committee has time to prepare an intelligent response. Someone's shaking his head. Is it disagree or something? Oh, sorry.
You don't want to hear us? You represent us, right?
Yes.
Why are you scared?
But we want to. But we want to hear you in the right forum, in the correct forum, and the forum is on a committee. So we have a chance to, the committee. And then if we discuss it with you at that committee meeting, where we have a chance to be informed of the issue and maybe do a little research and give you an appropriate answer.
Yes.
You work for
Yes.
us, I think.
Yes, we're not asking for the input yet. We're still discussing around the table.
Oh, sorry.
So,
Well, that's all I had to say, I guess.
yes.
Just procedurally, I would say that if the body does want to do a public hearing, it would be appropriate to instruct the clerk to do a public notice of that. Right? Typically, any public hearing we have, there's at least some sort of public notice that would be public. So I would say that it'd be appropriate to at least have a class 1, so there's at least one insertion of this public hearing.
And And I would just say that if it continues on past that point and it does go to leg, I totally agree with Alderman Charles that, and I will make the commitment to be there because I don't like it when it goes back and forth. And I understand it's very difficult for the committee, especially when we all have different ideas. So I would be in favor of, if it goes that far, that I would attend that meeting to avoid the back and forth.
Chris,
Is there a way to limit the amount of people, so we're not 200 people waiting to talk?
that would be part of the process after we decide if we're gonna do it or not.
Just a very broad overview, with public comments, it is permissible under state statutes to have that, but the typical recommendation is, as we've been talking about, to put reasonable rules in place. There's nothing specifically statutory about that, but there certainly are constitutional questions that come in, as far as once you allow people to talk on certain topics, you can't start eliminating viewpoints if you don't agree with them. So there are limits, but typically the types of regulations are the amount of time per person, the total amount of time for public comments in general. Sometimes it's limited by topic and that it has to be something on the agenda. There are a variety of other ones that again, would be discussed at these committee and council meetings of which ones, if you get that far, as the mayor said, that the body thinks is appropriate, but there's a wide variety of them, but and the body has some discretion, you just can't cross into some of the constitutional violations if you're not careful.
So we could put like a half an hour gap, and that's it, that's all they do.
Right, and then you'd have to figure out a system if you get more speakers than time of how to divvy that up.
Being that said, is that something, if we decide to have this go forward, is that the next discussion on the parameters on that public hearing? Or does that have to be done as part of the motion?
That was more for the public comment, when it's on the agenda, the rules. I think you would follow your normal public hearing procedures for this next meeting.
Okay.
I just have a question for Jesse. Let's say that we limit it to a half hour, just pick that number out there. And let's say nobody comes. So we come into the council meeting. Do we have to wait a half hour before we can start our council meeting?
Are you talking about next meeting?
No, the public comment. Now we've got it in, and would we have to wait a half hour? I mean, what if somebody come in 20 minutes? Do we have to stop and go to that?
You would, normally you would have a public comment section either as a individual agenda item, just like, consent agenda, so it would just be a rolling time. But someone would keep track of when it starts and then when it ends, so it doesn't go on forever. The other way that sometimes public comments are handled is you have a system of keeping track of who comes in the room, what items they want to talk about, and then determine whether they're going to speak in a general public comment section or their comments will be held until that agenda item comes up. Yeah, there's a wide range of ways this is handled.
But once that starts, if no one's here, we then end it. We don't have to wait that full half hour.
Correct.
Any additional comments? Al?
Okay. Actually, I'm against this. This is my second time on the council. And as many public hearings as I've been to because of this council, that are held before the council, held before committees, and there's nobody there. Now, why all of a sudden we have this one small group of people that want this? They've had the options to do this all along for years, and they don't show up for them. So I'm opposed to it. I really am. That's all I got to say, man.
I'm against it too. I think that these good people are misguided a little bit, and they're not familiar with the established way to get to deal with the council in a way that works. My advice is if it's not broken, why fix it? Why try to fix something that's not broken? And if you think it's broken, it's simply because you haven't gone through a few steps to get yourselves into a committee meeting. And I think that this is a poor issue to pursue just on principle, on some high-flying principle about freedom of speech or something like that. The committee, city government is mostly about how to spend the money and what projects get done. It's not a political thing. It never was a political thing. It never was something about freedom and rights and all of this stuff that seemed to be quite popular these days, especially on certain elements of our society. So I'm against this. I don't think it's needed, and I think it's a bunch of, I just don't think it's needed. I think there's ample apparatus set in place so that people can get their issues resolved in a quick way, and that's how I feel about it. If it's not broke, why fix it?
And I'm going to probably say this, oh, sorry. Marty?
Let's not confuse public hearings with public comments. I think we're voting on whether we should have a public hearing at the next meeting to talk about whether we want to have public comments on the agenda. So, let's make sure that we understand the difference between the two. Public hearing is where we have a hearing on a specific item, and we allow the public to come in and present their views. Public comment is sort of like an open mic session, where during the course of the meeting, we schedule a time where if people want to come in, they can come in and talk about anything.
Yeah, I guess I would just like to reiterate that the motion is not to add public comment. It's specifically just to have a session for people to share ideas about, if we wanted to add public comment, how we might most efficiently do that. That's simply the motion.
And I'll just say that I'll support that, and as I look at it right now, I would support in the future public comments as we discuss it next week, something to think about. I don't have any issue with people, if this is the time, I don't compare it to other public hearings. I've been here where people have been here when we've had issues that do affect people.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it's an opportunity, if they want to take the time to come down here before a meeting and voice an opinion about something, I have no problem with it. If that's the only time they can do it, they're taking the initiative. But I'm not going to blame people who want to come here and say that they shouldn't come here because they haven't been here for other ones. It's all going to be times that happen, things that happen, and I'll support it going forward.
It's not, so you're sort of already, can there also be comment on not having public comment at a meeting?
Mm-hmm.
The way the agenda is written, it's where the people are going to give us suggestions on how
Mm-hmm.
to have public comment on the agenda. To me, that only one-sided. It doesn't allow for comment from the public as those who oppose such an idea.
At every public hearing that we have, we ask people whether they are for or against it.
Correct.
To speak.
Okay, so that remains clear.
Correct.
Ready for a vote? Call the roll.
Shimpa,
Aye.
Charles,
Aye.
Crowley,
Aye.
Hahn,
Aye.
Havlicek,
Aye.
Mumford,
No.
Knopfreiner,
Aye.
Braden,
No.